So, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce today's episode with Jazmine Lowther, pro athlete, pro ultra runner, pro mostly trail runner. I won't be too long because we managed to cover a lot in this conversation. Jazmine lives in the Rockies in Canada. She's initially from, I believe, a small ski town in British Columbia. Um, she has very notable wins at races such as, this is a mouthful, one second, UTMB CCC in 2022, where she placed fourth. Her 2022 performance at Canyons 100K really put her on the map with a first place finish. She's now sponsored by North Face. She was a biologist. That's a very general term for what she did. She did an awful lot of complicated work in ecology with plants, which we get into a little bit here, which was really, really interesting. She raised some environmental concerns with, I'll let you listen, but it was something I wouldn't normally think a race could have an impact on, with the ecosystem of the race location. So that was really interesting. She is a part-time running coach along with her full-time running career at the moment. And yeah, honestly, just she's very, very knowledgeable. She writes articles on Strava, women's health, women's coaching, psychology and running. She's a very, very high achieving, intelligent woman, and it was just honestly it was really informative to speak to her. So yeah, hope you enjoy this episode.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm Helen. Nice to meet you. Do you prefer Jazz or Jazmine?
I go by both. Usually after a conversation, then I'll start saying jazz. But yeah, both absolutely work.
Okay, I'm gonna stick with Jazmine for now to be safe.
Yeah, yeah,
Sounds good.
yeah. And it is funny because my last name is Lowther, and it's actually my heritage is in England. There's like this huge Lowther castle, so I do need to go hop over the pond and
Wait, so
visit
it's
the UK.
it's related. That's actually where your
Yeah,
surname came
yeah,
from. Oh,
yeah.
that's interesting.
Do you know
Okay.
the Lowther Castle?
I don't know. Where
You
is
don't.
it?
I have no idea. It's somewhere in the UK, but
It
yeah,
sounds almost like Scottish to me.
yeah. I think I think there is like some Scottish mix in there, and yeah, so it's cool that you're over kind of in that area.
Nice. Yeah, very much in that area. It's a change
Yeah,
from Americans being Irish as well. I mean, you're not
mhm,
American, you're Canadian, but still, it's
yeah, yeah,
we're all related somehow.
yes, exactly. Yeah,
In fact, actually, yeah, that actually nicely leads on to the intro. I believe you're still living in Canada, aren't you? You're in the Rockies at the moment.
yeah. So I moved to the Rocky Mountains in this little town. It's called Canmore, Alberta, and it's right in the nested in this beautiful valley. On either sides you've got big mountains, and it's just a crazy wonderful playground, winter and summer, but definitely for summer there's just like thousands of miles of trails that you can run in the alpine, and it's super stunning. You definitely have to watch out for bears a lot, but a little different from you guys. But
Um,
yeah, it's just like endless, so it's great. Yeah,
oh my God, you really put me off.
I,
Yeah.
I got you on the bears. Yeah,
Yeah, you did.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm worried enough about sheep out here, so so maybe not for me.
yeah. Some aggressive sheep. I'm sure that happens.
Nor are
Yeah,
the temperatures though. I was listening to another podcast you did earlier today to do my
mhm,
research, the Just
yeah,
in Stride
yeah.
podcast, and you mentioned I'm hoping this was in your winters, but you said
Yes.
it went into the minus 20s
Oh yeah.
Celsius.
Oh
D-
yeah. Yeah. Even minus 30s. Yeah.
Oh my
It
God.
gets bloody cold. It's Yeah. That is definitely a con, is that it'll have like these cold snaps where 1 to 2 weeks it'll be -25 average. You'll get some like -32s in there. I mean, historically it would go -40. So you have to be, if you want to run outside, you have to like cover every single inch of your face. You need to put like either tape on your face so you don't get frostbite, which is pretty real. You meet a lot of people who have gotten like frostbite and they'll have little white spots on their nose. Or you put, I guess Vaseline also works, but it's almost like you're going scuba diving.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
yeah,
Because
it's
yeah, I'm real. My ignorance is showing here. I'm sorry, but I thought those temperatures, surely do they not irritate your airways? Like I
yeah,
couldn't breathe in that.
yeah. No, they do. So you don't want to do it too much, and you wouldn't want to do intensity. And then definitely if you've got like asthma or any sort of lung
Yeah.
issues, then 100%. It's definitely one of those things where like do it every once in a while if you want to cross that line. But otherwise the treadmill has to become your BFF.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, okay, well, that's incredible that you live there and train there in itself. That's like pretty badass already.
No, yeah. Sometimes you question your sanity, and I'm starting to think more of like how can you train down south um uh affordably? How can you make that happen? And every
Yeah,
once in a while you get, it's called a Chinook, where it's like a south wind comes up and then it brings some positive temperatures. So it'll be like +10 Celsius all of a sudden. And you're like, whoa, I'm at the beach. So we do get that, thankfully. It's not all like a frozen ice cube. But yeah,
yeah,
long winters. And right now today it was snowing again and it's April 17th. It's like, what's going on?
positive. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, were you, I realize you've gone from, you had a career as a biologist, I believe, and now you've gone full time trail running. Were you living in Canmore? My thought is there weren't any plants for you to study in the in those temperatures. Did you move away from where you were working?
It's hilarious. You're not wrong, because I always joke of how so Canmore is in the province of Alberta, which is, for folks who aren't super familiar, there's like the Rocky Mountains on the west side of Alberta, and then it becomes just like grassland and flat plains and lots of farmland and stuff like that. And it can be very dry. It's very, very dry. So all of the water usually goes onto the other side of the mountains in British Columbia, where I used to live. And you're right, there's a lot more plants on that side, a lot more greenery. We call Alberta, there's like 3 shades of green, whereas I was literally just in BC and it's like, wow, there's like 50 shades of green over here.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, but yeah, so I was a biologist focusing on plants where I previously lived in actually my hometown called Nelson, and it's this cute little ski town, more humble mountains, things like that, but also lovely trails. And then so I was working there as a biologist. And as I got into more and more into trail running, and when I started to work with my main sponsor, the North Face, which was like hugely exciting, but I wanted to dive into it even more. And I think most professional athletes, and probably anyone can relate, where your training and work start to uh, there's some tension there.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's always like, how do I make this work and how do I make it more feasible for the amount of time I need to train?
Mm.
And my hours as a biologist sometimes would be very long, doing field work in the summer. It's super fun, very rewarding work. And I definitely want to still continue that passion, at least for providing some sort of environmental stewardship in my life. But yeah, I jumped ship, which was really scary. But I was at the same time building my coaching business. So also was coaching lots of athletes in trail running, and that took off. And now I'm able to work full time as a professional athlete, which there's a lot more to being an athlete than just training. There's a lot of conversations and commitments that you have ongoing. And then with coaching, your hours can be more flexible. I will say though, there is a lot of time. It's just like a big pit of time that you can put into coaching, and becoming like a entrepreneur and self-employed, with kind of the personality type that you take on a lot, and you want to do a good job. I've realized, yeah, you really have to pace yourself, or I definitely have had to pace myself. And then, yeah, I'm also writing for a number of different magazines. I've been writing for Strava, which has been super exciting. They're like, what sort of topics do you want to write about? And for me, yeah, recently it's been a lot of topics on female athlete health, and kind of being that bridge between science. So I'll like read 30 papers, and then I'll try to filter that into kind of like a written blog post, of any sort of takeaways on current research on whether it's female athletes or training or different protocols that we can be using. Yeah, so those three kind of cups are quite full, and yeah, they keep me very engaged. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, you just covered about 3 topics there that I actually wanted to touch on all of them.
Yeah.
But I'm going to pick one and go with it
Yes.
for now, which is what you
Yeah.
just mentioned. I did read about some of your blog posts, and I think as a biologist, you probably understand a lot better what is going on in female bodies, a lot more than any of us do. So I would like to talk about your experience with Red S as a runner, as a coach, how you recognize signs and the science behind it. Because I do realize it's very understudied at the moment, especially as women don't seem to get any funding. But yeah, tell us about what Red S is, how it's affected you, and yeah, your outcome for, well, I guess there's not a definite outcome yet for you from it, but your story with that.
Yeah, and feel free to jump in, because it sounded like, from what I know about you, you might have also crossed into that
Yeah.
fun experience of, oh shoot, I'm now in that stat. So yeah, for folks who aren't super familiar, but Red S is relative energy deficiency in sport, and it is a condition that can be difficult, at least right now, um, to confirm that you are within that box. There's definitely signs, and there's ways to check for it, but basically it means, or it is brought on by chronically low energy availability. So basically the amount of energy output is not being matched by the energy input. So it's very common in endurance athletes or people who are training a lot. They have big energy output, big caloric expenditure, and then what they're ingesting isn't quite matching that. And over long term, the body starts to be like, hey, wait a minute, we're not getting enough energy, and it kind of goes into a fight or flight state where the body is really smart and it starts to shut down things, systems that are not quite necessary for surviving. So one of the first things to go is our reproductive system. And what I mean by that is like our reproductive hormones start to shut down, or some of those systems start to turn off. And that definitely has a lot of consequences that yeah, are one, they're not very fun to experience and can have long-term consequences. Yeah, things from osteoporosis or low bone density, Alzheimer's, dementia, and then other disorders, definitely if it goes on for a long time. Yeah, and then obviously if you want to conceive a child, and some other simple things like our libido basically gets turned off and things like that. So yeah, I think for myself, I was very aware of it. I think there's been a pretty great job in the community of how certain I guess people in the public, people like Stacy Sims. She's awesome. She's got her book Roar, and she's leading the way with her social media platforms and really helping people understand, okay, this is how we can become more aware of it. This is like some of the signs to look out for, things like that. And women are not small men. That's her big tagline. But yeah, there's so many truths to that. Yeah, so for myself, yeah, we could probably go back to one of my performances. It probably came across for me. It was after CCC, which I had run that fall in France of September 2022. And I don't think I definitely did not realize it for a long time. But then once I did realize it, which was February of 2023, so about whatever that is, 6 months. That's the first big sign that I realized, like, oh, I'm at risk here, was I missed a period. And so that's one of the biggest, what if you want to call it like a symptom, is loss of menstrual cycle for women. For men, they might have things like low testosterone, low libido, depression, changes in mood. For women, yeah, loss of menstrual cycle. There's tons of low libido, energy, kind of foggy energy. Could be like increased acne, getting sick a lot, so like a weak immune system, irritable bowel syndrome, or like food sensitivities, which I definitely have, or had definitely experienced. And then actually weight gain can happen, or like inflammation. And then intense sweet cravings, which also I had experienced. So yeah, so back to February 2023, I had just ran Trans Gran Canaria, which is 130K and I don't know, 7,000 meters or something like that. And after that, yeah, I lost my cycle, and instantly I was like, oh no, let's look into this, because I also had this injury that was very mysterious to me. And then we found out as well that it was a bone stress injury. So right away, I was like, okay, put two and two together. I have lost my cycle. I just got a bone stress injury, which due to low bone density and a few other things, but that's where it can be really tricky. And looking back at my data of my menstrual cycles, I could also see that the length between menses, or my periods, was increasing. And then there was a few times where my actual period had shrank to like 2, maybe 3 days. So I had that data. I hadn't been following it quite as much as I should have. And those are all learnings in hindsight for sure. It's like a really long, at least a year, even more. So that was February. Yeah, only this past fall did I fully get my cycles back normal. And to be clear, I didn't have like full loss of cycle. I had irregular cycles.
Yeah.
So I believe that's called oligomenorrhea. Yeah, my cycles were on average about 60 to 60 days, which a normal cycle for myself was around 30 days. So
Yeah. Wow.
yeah, yeah. So that was interesting, and yeah, I think for me also what I found surprising was that I had actually gained weight, which was why initially I didn't really think, oh, I would be someone who would get red S, because I think that's a bit of a stereotype. And it can be
Yeah.
true, definitely, where women who are more thin, very lean, don't have very many like fat stores, can definitely be more at risk. But one of the symptoms, or one of the side effects, is that you do get more inflammation, and your cortisol is a bit out of whack. And then I was getting these like intense sweet cravings, and it was really hard. It was like, what is wrong with me? Like, and it almost, and for someone who's like an athlete, you're like, oh my God, I'm gaining weight, so I need to like go on a diet and like restrict calories. And it's actually the opposite thing that you need to do. You need to focus. It can be really hard, easier said than done, but you need to focus on actually like increasing your calories, and getting in really like healthy carbohydrates, regular meals, so like no fasting, and having regular meals like 3 hours apart, things like that.
Mm.
Yeah, which are really hard, but yeah. And I know for yourself, you also had was it red S that you experienced, or a bit?
They're not entirely, well, yes,
Yeah.
actually. When I was 17 to 21, I didn't have a single period. So I could have lost up to 16% of my bone density, which I'm
Wow.
laughing now, it's not funny.
Yeah.
But no one told me was the
Mhm.
issue.
Yeah.
And I've had a similar thing recently. I mean, I also have endometriosis, so
Okay.
it was a blessing when they went. Obviously not good for my overall health, but I've recently, well, a year ago, I went on the contraceptive patch, which you just stick
Mhm.
on once a week, and then
Mhm.
so you do 3 weeks on, 1 week off. Um, and it can kind of, I got really unwell after my first ultra, and it kind of was attributed in my head to burnout. I had done a lot leading up to it,
Mhm.
and wasn't very sensible overall in my training, I wouldn't say. But the doctor, one of the doctors I saw quite a few, she did suggest red S, as a possibility. They did my bloods and everything. It sounds, listening to you and from my own experience, it's so hard to diagnose, so
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of the same symptoms, like I was just uncontrollably falling asleep. I couldn't help it.
Mhm.
I was so
Wow.
tired. And I did want sugar. And then I have put weight on, and I'm not speaking for you, but I know a lot of, I wouldn't call myself an athlete, but female endurance athletes do historically come from an eating disorder background. So being
Mhm.
told that you need to eat more when you have
Yeah.
put weight on from
Yeah.
this, it's very difficult to
It's
digest,
yeah.
because that goes against everything that you've thought about
Yeah.
nutrition. So it seems like a very, very complicated condition, and I'm not sure whether I'm still going through it, but it sounds like you were very sensible in your recovery. I guess, did you do the research and make a plan essentially as soon as you found out that you had missed a period?
Yeah. I definitely had probably a few moments of not super sensible. And I would hope that that can be an example just for people, because I did fall into that trap of like, oh my God, I'm gaining weight, and like, and yet I'm being told I have to eat more. And yeah, it's extremely difficult when you're in that position. Because I just realizing like, oh, my clothes aren't fitting, I don't look how I used to. And for an athlete, a lot of your identity is tied to that, as well as your performance, which it can be really tricky to digest, going down that path in a healthy way. I think finally it really clicked for me this past kind of like late summer, where I was getting onto more of just a regular, like, having breakfast first thing in the morning, getting back into that habit, and making sure I was getting enough carbs and protein, iron supplements, because my iron was quite low as well. Yeah, so that and if I did have a period of stress, or I think there was a period where I was feeling a bit more low confidence, depression, all of those things. And I did go down that slippery slope of like, oh, well, what if I try fasting and things like that? And it probably did me much more harm, prolonged the process of recovery, and all of those things. Yeah, so definitely not perfect. And even, yeah, hearing the news of getting like bone stress reactions in my foot. I had all 5 of my toes had some bone stress reactions, and I definitely had one more like severe one. And even this week before we were talking, I was thinking of going to get a DEXA scan just to check up on my bone density. So yeah, and it's tricky because to figure out if you're in that zone of RED-S. Yeah, I think just lining up some of the symptoms is one way for athletes to recognize like, oh, I'm at risk here. And then, like you say, if you do have a history of eating disorders, that can lead to some of those like controlling behavior types. And then in terms of like testing, yeah, blood work is a good place to start. And then if you want to go down the road of looking at your hormones, I really wanted to. It was quite expensive. And for us here in Canada, a Dutch hormone panel to look at like all of your sex hormones, yeah, it costs $500 to $600. And you kind of need to do a few of them to really get like a good sense. And then the other tricky part, if you're having irregular cycles, at least for me, it was like, well, I don't know when I'm going to have my next period. And it's really important if you do get those tests to have them as on the same day of your cycle, or as close to as possible, so that you're comparing your hormone levels at the same stage. And yeah, it's like, well, I had a 40-day cycle and now a 60-day cycle. So yeah, that was a little confusing. And it would be great if we had some better protocols for helping with that.
Yeah. So it sounds, from what you've just said and from scaring myself from reading about it last night as well, it sounds like currently there's a research gap in that area. I was also really surprised. I had a false sense of security being on contraception, that my bone density would be okay, and it doesn't have any effect at all. So it must be very hard for women to monitor, well, yeah, hormone levels in general. I know when mine's coming up because I have a withdrawal bleed that I take the patch off every month. But it's kind of ironic that you need to know exactly where you are in the cycle, and the whole problem is that you're not having a cycle. Yeah, it sounds like more research needed. which again, yeah, Stacey Sims really recommend following her. She keeps everyone up to date on what's going on.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, she's
but
excellent. Yeah, you do bring up a good point with the contraception, and that is something that I do hope that more female athletes become more familiar or at least more informed. And so there's benefits and there's pros and cons. But just being aware that being on any site sort of hormonal contraception, it can mask red S and for some athletes, and it is a story that is not uncommon where women, as soon as they go off of their hormonal contraception, they realize they don't have a cycle. And
mm,
so being on hormonal contraception and even some of the hormonal IUDs, it can mask red S, and you might not be having a cycle and you don't even know it because you're having those withdrawal bleeds, which aren't a true
yeah,
menstruation. So yeah, it's good to just be informed and just realize like those risks, and try to still be tracking like your cycle as best as possible. Um, and then for folks who have a natural cycle, yeah, definitely have like with all the athletes that I work with, I try to get them to have some sort of menstrual tracking app. There's so many out there, but yeah, Stacey Sims, she also works with the Wild AI app, and it does
okay,
track lots of symptoms within your cycle. So um, for myself, I actually track my body temperature every single day, and that way I can have a more clear picture of like, okay, I just ovulated, or oh, I'm going into my luteal phase, because your body temperature changes. And it's as simple as you just have like a thermometer beside your bed and you take your temperature first thing in the morning every day.
yeah,
And then I have in the past also had a box of luteinizing hormone strips. So they're like basically the pregnancy detector strips.
yeah.
You can get them really cheap on Amazon, and then you just you pee in a cup and then you dip it in your urine, and then it tells you if you've ovulated or not. So that's another
Wow.
way for people to track. And other things, yeah, sleep disturbances, sometimes even like hunger or what you're craving. As you're going into your luteal phase, you might be craving some more carbs, more chocolate, some more sweet things. And that's a good way to tell. Even like discharge types, I'm not an expert on it, but that changes. So yeah, no, it is really important just to track your menstrual cycle, because if it does change, that can be like a really good, um, just a flag for like, oh, hey, your body might be taking on a bit more stress this month, or yeah, maybe just to like tone training down, or it could be any type of stress in your life, whether work, relationships, travel is a huge one, going through different time zones, things like that. And yeah, I think for myself, I learned by tracking your cycle and being more in touch with it, you can nip it in the butt before it becomes something more serious. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's super key.
Sounds
Yeah.
amazing to me. You're very on it, which again I guess comes a little easier to you with the biology background. But very useful for all of us to know. So thank you.
Yeah.
I guess have you brought that, or to what extent do you bring that to your coaching with female athletes?
Yeah. And I think that's really important for any coach, and something that I have struggled with as an athlete myself is working with other coaches. But um, yeah, it's hugely important for the coach to breach the topic and to make it become like a safe space for athletes to feel comfortable, um, seeking support in that arena. The coach needs to be, proactive. And I just wrote a column on effective coaching for female athletes. And that is a big thing in terms of the coach just providing that safe space. Because oftentimes a female athlete, and I've experienced this with all of the male coaches I've ever had, where, the topic might come up maybe once at the beginning of the relationship, but then there's never like a follow-up. And over time, that can kind of erode some trust and feelings of safety for an athlete. With my athletes, it's definitely in our very first conversation, it's something that we'll chat about. And I like to identify if someone is at a higher risk, or, if they've had like a past, if they're comfortable sharing that, if they've ever been through disordered eating or even still have some of those tendencies. And then, and then just having that candid chat, what type of contraception are they using? And then if they are using hormonal, just for them to be aware, because I think a lot of times these days, if you go to a doctor, the doctor may not be trained in knowing very much about all of these things that we're talking about. And there's kind of that lack of informed consent for the patient. And they might be taking birth control, pill, whatever, and not understanding the risks associated with it. And then I do try to follow up, and whether people need to get blood work completed. Sometimes it's multiple times a year. Like if someone does have low iron, and most endurance athletes have low iron, that's just that's a whole other conversation in itself. But iron levels are hugely impacted by endurance sports. We're sweating out our iron, and then our absorption is basically goes way downhill when you do endurance sports. So supplementing it is really helpful for energy and optimal health and things like that. But so it does get woven in there, and some athletes are very interested in cycle syncing their training. And I lay it out as like, let's be aware of your cycle, and let's potentially modulate things, because some women do have pretty severe, whether it's like cramping around their menstrual cycle, or low energy, things like that. And so we might do like a little deload during certain times of the month. But I don't want it to become something that holds them back. And that's kind of like the double-edged sword. It's like, on the one hand, when we get really hyper-focused on understanding our body, like lots of great things happen and things like that. But like, let's give ourselves some grace and like, know, oh, hey, I might not be feeling like as confident or as powerful when I go into the gym today. But like, let's still go to the gym. Let's be curious. And you might still have like a personal best. You might still like have a really good session. Because I think some women do get a little bit like, oh, I'm like in my late luteal phase. I'm just gonna do yoga and like chill on the couch. And there might be some times where like, okay, that's needed, but let's not like train only 2 weeks a month, and it's just gonna hold us back. So lots of stuff there, but it's at the very least we need to be having those conversations for sure.
No, I think that's great. And well, you mentioned that you haven't had much luck with male coaches, and on one hand, I completely understand their side, because why would they think about it? They don't have to think about it. But on the other hand, we're 50% of the population who they're going to be coaching, and they ought to be thinking about it and learning about it. So I can understand why it's easier. to have a female coach, especially one like you who's very active in thinking about it. But yeah, there's clearly a lot of room for improvement, which will come with research and awareness, most likely.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. We're kind of at this point where like it's really exciting. Like more women are getting into sports and like endurance sports and ultra running. And yeah, so there's like this huge boom in how many women are getting more active and want to work with coaches. And then at the same time, I think definitely in the past 10 years, 5 years, there's the majority of coaches are men. Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's true for most sports, many sports. I did just write an article on this, and like many of the Olympic teams, like they didn't even have like any female coaches. And yeah, there's a ton of examples out there how, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's lagging behind. There's definitely more and more women becoming coaches, but yeah, it's really hard to find. Because
Yeah.
I've been through a process like the last 2 years was trying to find a coach, and I worked with a few male coaches, and some of them would like bring up certain topics around female health, and but I did find sometimes they would say something that was incorrect, and that would kind of like jostle
Put
me a
your
little bit, like, oh, if they don't fully understand it, then like why am I going to go to them
Yeah.
to seek support in this? And yeah, certain things would come up where it's like, oh, I'm racing this race and I'm in my late luteal phase. I feel like I have no confidence and I'm kind of freaking out. And yeah, just to have someone at least understand and provide some support can be really helpful. So
Yeah.
yeah, with male coaches, yeah, I think there's like a few things going on, and it's definitely very understudied in the ultra running world. But it is really interesting how I looked at a number of studies. I think mostly more so in team sports, but male coaches can have biases, whether conscious or subconscious, of
Yeah.
especially if they're coaching both men and women, potentially in separate environments. Say they've got a female team and a male team.
Yeah.
They they've done these observational studies where they saw some very clear differences in how the same coach would be working with both teams. And
Right.
yeah, it was really interesting. So like male coaches were providing like double the positive reinforcement for the women, which is interesting. It was they thought it was in a way to be providing like extra confidence for the women and also to be likable to all the girls. And yeah, but there are some negative consequences to that. If you provide too much positive reinforcement to an athlete, over
Yeah.
time it can erode trust. It can make their self-esteem actually lower.
Mm.
And it can appear not genuine. So
Yeah.
you kind of have to find that balance of enough positive reinforcement and things like that. Um, and then also interestingly, female athletes, well, goes kind of without saying that they do require, especially when working with a male coach, longer time to build trust.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So I think just for men, if you're working with women, just be aware of that, and like that's where they need to be proactive and really make that safe space. And
Yeah.
I think there'd be a lot of benefits there. So I know when I've been coached by men, I tend to like shut down after a while if I feel like, oh, this isn't a safe space anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then another interesting point was that women would often ask a lot more questions than the male athletes, and that's whether that's like a curiosity or learning the why behind their training. And this when and this would often result in the male coaches being like, oh, women are more needy and require more time, things like that. But yeah, I think it can be really beneficial if they are able to explain the why behind their training and just to allow for more of a democratic or collaborative approach to training. Yeah, there's a lot about it, and it's hugely interesting, like the topic of coaching dynamics. Yeah, it's a huge world. I realized when I started researching it, and it's definitely has changed the way how I approach coaching, and just being aware of of certain things, like how I would approach these topics, and okay, let's make sure that we follow up on this, and yeah, just being a bit more conscious in creating that like consistent communication around these topics.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a huge amount of trust is required, isn't it? And if you don't feel like the coach is being as attentive as you would prefer, I feel like, yeah, it can easily break. And also just the dynamic between men and women you mentioned there is just hilarious because it sounds like a relationship. It's the same issues that
it's
men
just
and
like a
women
relationship.
typically have. Yeah. One is very practical, logical minded, usually, and the other wants to understand. No, I need to know the reason for that. And yeah, I understand both sides. As an engineer, I'm used to typically dealing with the stereotypical man. It's just very. We have about 90% men in our company, and it took me about 6 months just to work with another woman on a project. But I am used to, I now can understand the logical men a bit better, and navigate it a bit better. But it was definitely a struggle to begin with. I've definitely cried in front of a couple of them because they just weren't understanding what I was saying. It's frustrating. So especially with a coach who you need to feel like properly understands you and your feedback, it's very important.
I just hope that people can become a bit more aware of these topics, and definitely for coaches to be a bit more aware of how they're proactively initiating these conversations, men and women. Is some of the female coaches can bring their own biases to how female athletes are experiencing things, and that was this one research paper highlighted of female coaches aren't like shining perfect examples, but you can bring your own biases, and then some female coaches also weren't up to date on some of the information. So just for everyone to be a bit more aware and proactive. All good things. Progress is
100%.
happening.
100%. So without completely switching subjects, so I just wanted to cover one of the other subjects that you mentioned in your email, if that's okay. I wanted to talk about the environmental effects of running, and you phrased it really well, actually. You said the moral dilemma of running globally, which I really liked talking to one of my other interviewees about before. But I also found it really interesting in the podcast I listened to earlier with yourself. You mentioned about it was something I just really hadn't ever considered at all. I think when I think about environmental impact, I think flights, like long journeys to race, and also I hate seeing, I think they've changed the law about it here now, actually, but I hate seeing plastic cups everywhere after a race. It really gets me. But you mentioned about invasive species. I found that really interesting because I don't think most of us would ever consider that. as an impact, but actually it must be quite a big one from what you said.
Yeah, and it could be researched more. I definitely have found a few research papers that 100% confirmed that trail running events introduce invasive species to the local event area. I mean, you think of UTMB and you're bringing like thousands of people from across the world, probably with some muddy trail running shoes, with clothing that they've been wearing outside. And absolutely, there's going to be pieces and fragments of different plants, bacteria, fungi, all in the mud and things like that that they have on their all of their belongings, and then going and running whatever 100 miles or anything like that in this unique and beautiful area. Yeah, so it is something for all of us to be more aware, and you can do simple things like cleaning your shoes more regularly, like getting all the mud and tread out anytime, especially anytime that you're going from like one trail system, like even for you going between like I'm gonna get this wrong, between like Glasgow and wait, you're in the Bell region? No.
Lake District, yeah.
Lake
Close.
District. Yes. Yeah, and that can be something for as simple as just like a little toothbrush and cleaning the mud off and things like that. Yeah, and I was just in Hawaii, and even there, so I used to work with invasive species, especially invasive plants. And one thing with invasive plants is often when you travel, you'll see those species, the same species that like I focus on here in Canada. I'll see it over in France, or else I saw some of them in Hawaii. Wherever you go across the world, you'll often see those same species. And usually I'm like, uh-oh, is it also invasive here? Or, oh, is it actually native here? So I know in Canada, some of the species that are quite invasive, there's this one in particular called mouse ear hawkweed. It's this tiny little plant, and it just over time totally carpets the ground, and it can be really hard to get rid of once it establishes itself. And it's actually native to Switzerland. And we were doing a lot of research in Switzerland, researching like the natural predators. There's these little flies that lay its eggs in it. And there's programs that actually introduce the natural predators to wherever it is invasive. It's highly regulated, obviously. There's all those nightmare stories of, in Australia when I forget what it was, but there was like toads, and they have like camels, and anyways, was it the toads? They introduced something else to kill something, and then that species became invasive. So there's those examples where it goes completely wrong. Most folks aren't aware, but those programs are still going on, and there's quite a few governments between different countries that work together, and they do a ton of research. Usually it takes at least a decade of research where they will look at this natural predator. They'll do a ton of quarantine, and then they look at, will this natural predator feed on something that's related to it? So is it going to like feed on any crops or like strawberries, things like that? And if they find anything, yes, then that it just stops there, and it won't be introduced. But there have been quite a few successful introductions of natural predators from the origin where the plant species is native, and then where the plant species is invasive, they will introduce that natural predator. And I used to work with like all these sorts of different insects. Some of them are really cool, and we would collect them, we'd reproduce them, and then we'd release more into the wild. So it is this whole other topic, but for trail runners to be aware, we are vectors of invasive species, and yes, it's great to travel and like you get to see so many beautiful places, but just be aware that oftentimes trails are like highways for invasive species. I think every race I've ever run, I've seen invasive species along those trails, and usually people are like, "Oh wow, look at all the beautiful wildflowers," and it's like, actually, that's Scotch broom, and that is invasive, 100%. Yeah, California, in Gran Canaria, Spain, in Chamonix, France, all over the States, Canada, you name it, there's invasive species, and we can do our best to try to keep the seeds off. So if you do see seeds on your clothing, I guess a few different things. If you're still at the trail where you got them, then like some trails will have boot brushes, though it's kind of rare, but you would want to pick off the seeds. If there's a garbage can, that's great, but otherwise just like leave it at that site where it's already there. And then if you're already home, then like put it into a double bagged garbage bag and clean off all of the material, things like that. Sometimes you need tweezers, and yeah, so pretty simple. It takes 5 minutes, hopefully, and you can get a lot of it off.
Yeah. No, I'll definitely be taking that advice because I honestly just had no idea. Which I kind of hope, I'm assuming that no one else has any idea as well. Otherwise, I'll feel like a terrible human being. But,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah.
I had this.
Sorry, can I just
Yeah,
define for the
yeah,
is it layman among us? That's the right word, isn't it? Like by invasive species, you just mean a species which is taken from one ecosystem to another and has a negative impact on that other ecosystem. Is that right?
yeah. That's a pretty good, yeah, simplified definition. So something that's non-native, it's been introduced to another area, and then has a negative impact. And typically they're able to reproduce very well, whether through like a ton of seeds or they have some sort of special characteristic that allows them to be so successful. And then as well, they usually don't have any natural predators. So there's nothing that's like eating them to keep their populations in check. And they just like spread like wildfire. Invasive species management is very similar to disease control and wildfire control.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so you see like these hotspots, and then usually there's like a source. So there's lots of different ways that you can strategize tackling invasive species, but usually you want to get it before it's become widely established.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And a species can be introduced to an area and it just kind of naturalizes. That's, we call it naturalized, but it doesn't become invasive. So in horticulture, hopefully most of the species that they're selling, I will say a lot of species that horticultural centers sell are also invasive. So when you're buying plants,
Great.
just like be aware and do some research. Like, is this plant invasive? If you've got a yard and you're going to be planting it outside, then definitely good to do some research there. And then even things like house plants, some of the plants that we have indoors can be quite invasive outside. In Canada, it's maybe not as much of a problem because it's so cold outside in the winter, so it'll kill a lot of the species. But I mean, man, if you're somewhere with a bit more of like a Mediterranean climate or not as severe of temperature shifts, I mean, yeah, Hawaii is like a prime example. I'm like, wow, if any of the invasive species that I worked with came to Hawaii, that island system would just be, almost like destroyed. And invasive species, they're up there in the, I think it's like the top 3 biggest contributors to extinction. Yeah,
Wow.
it's pretty huge, really. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Feels like another quite. Maybe that's just because I'm not in the field at all, but it feels like quite an unknown topic still.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of those topics where it's like, oh hey, I'm here, but it's not quite out there to, it hasn't quite, I think people who are aware of them, it's almost you're preaching to the choir, but then getting the information further out. Yeah,
Yeah.
I had approached a few races to see if, hey, if we had some sort of like awareness, just like a quick, even a few sentences in their pre-race meeting, like, hey, can
Yeah.
everyone clean their shoes and make sure that all of their gear is free of any sort of material and mud. I think it would be just a really simple due diligence for all of us
Yeah.
to start practicing. Yeah.
So what was the response that you got from that then, from the races?
Um, Initially they were like, yeah, yeah, we'll do it. And then I don't think it really, I don't think it happened, but and that is, yeah. Um, ho- Hopefully one of my side projects that I can make happen a little bit more. I am
Mm.
on the board of the Pro Trail Runners Association and the PTRA, and I think a lot of us are um, questioning like how can we have more impact and get more trail runners aware of these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Um, so working with them, that's one idea I have. Or I don't know, I might be creating a not-for-profit in the next year. We'll see. That's another one
Nice.
of those projects. But
Yeah.
yeah, just to help have a bit more of a voice rather than just being like, oh hey, I'm a runner and maybe you guys could start implementing this.
Yeah.
Because things
Yeah.
like the Western States Trail, I was definitely very worried because I know in that area they have a lot of invasive species along the trail. Um,
Right.
and then after a fire, you've lost a lot of that vegetation, and it's just like a early succession, meaning like the huge the fire has gone through. It's just kind of bare dirt and a lot of the plant seeds that are going to be coming in from the area. Whoever gets there first is going to be
Mm.
winning. And so having races along those exposed areas is kind of like a bit of a nightmare where it's like, okay, here we go. This is a very vulnerable ecosystem. And now we're going to have like hundreds of people walking along this trail, probably with invasive plant material, seeds,
Yeah.
plant fragments, stuff like that. So, yeah, that was definitely on my mind for the
Yeah.
Western States Trail. But yeah,
Well, I'm probably
yeah,
gonna edit this bit out.
yeah,
But on a personal level, do you not think there's a niche for you there to go in as a sort of consultant to big races and have a almost like a guidance document that can be sent out? I don't want to give you yet another project. You must be much lower on energy than me, but it sounds like that's a bit um there's lacking information. Say to these big race directors if they had something that they could look at and work from, and if you were contactable, yeah, as a freelance consultant to events like Western State, that sounds like something. I don't know. It's just an
yeah,
idea. It sounds like something you could do, and it merges your two careers then, which is
yeah,
great. um,
yeah, yeah. I guess the thing I would have to figure out is, um, well, one, would they hire a consultant in the first place? So you need to create um, some sort of reward, and
yeah.
that could be, I could think about, okay, working with different organizations who are creating, because I think there's like races can get certain sort of like green standard awards stamps on their race, and they can have that on their website. Like I know for women's kind of equality, the Trail Sisters in the States, they kind of put their stamp on certain races. And then Jazmine Paris is part of the Green Trail Runners.
Green runners.
Green runners. So PTRA, I think, has been thinking about, okay, how could we create some sort of like standard, and if races meet that, then we can give them that like stamp of approval. And just and then for athletes, they can like pick and choose, oh, I want to be supporting races that have this accreditation. Keep your eyes peeled. It might be like trail stewards or something like that. And if anyone ever wants to reach out, then like, please do. It'll be one of those things where I'm very open to ideas, and the main thing would just be connecting trail runners to different networks. So
no, it sounds really good.
And then just for races to be aware of like how they're stationing their aid stations and any sort of like vehicles, parking areas, things like that. And like for Western states, as an example, or any race, it's like if you're putting like tents on grass or any sort of like areas that are either vegetated or totally open bare soil, well, trying to avoid those areas and like keeping to like parking lots or gravel areas as much as possible. And then if you do have to use any of those areas where you might be disturbing soil, trying to not have as much traffic in there as possible, like not moving things around, and all of the equipment should be washed before going in. But just try not to like move and jostle things around, because anytime you disturb soil, that just helps any introduced seed get into the ground more.
It all makes a lot of sense when you say it, but I feel like people don't think about it.
It's connecting the dots. So
well, I don't want to use any more of your time. I actually think we got through the topics that I wanted to from the email. I literally cannot put into words how much I've enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been actually enlightening. So
awesome.
I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And lovely to meet you. And what can we look forward to? First of all, where can we find you on social media? I know that, but people who listen to won't. And what have you got coming up in the immediate future, just to end on?
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate the conversation and diving more into these topics that are at heart. I know we could talk much longer about them, but if people want to follow along with my story as it unravels, I am mostly on Instagram at Jazmine, spelled JAZMINE_Lowther, LOWTHER. Otherwise, my website, probably do that, is www.jazminelowther.com. You can say hi to me anywhere. And this summer, I'm hoping to do Broken Arrow. Definitely really want to do Speed Goat 50K in beautiful Salt Lake City in the Wasatch Mountains there. And then I did get on the list for UTMB, which is really exciting. So that's been my dream for a long time. So take my first whack at the 100-mile distance there over at UTMB. Wow. So fingers crossed. My main thing is like keeping healthy, and it's going to be a bit of a slow start to the year for me. Just getting out of my mess and tangle with red S and bone stress injuries and all of that. So it's having lots more patience, and this is kind of like a slower year for me, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah, definitely. Well, I will be watching out for all of those, and all the best. Yeah, I'm sure I'll be in contact with you in the future anyway. I mean, I'm gonna need to email you after this anyway, so
Yeah, definitely. I gotta hop over the pond and go visit your neck of the woods sometime. It's been on my list, and
yes,
I keep
do.
wanting to do Snowdonia. I have one athlete I coach who does it every year, and it just looks so badass.
Yeah.
Lots of running through wet bogs, I understand, but man, the mountains there look epic.